Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight for you I have a chilling collection of haunted hotel scary stories, and I would like to wish our esteemed friend Logan a very happy birthday. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I work at a hotel, and for privacy reasons, I'm not going to reveal the exact name or location. But unexplained things happened there more often than you would expect in a place that is supposedly to be routine and predictable. Most hotels do have the occasional strange story, especially from night staff who spend long hours working there. But at our property, there is one specific room that stands out above all the others. Anyone who has worked here for more than a few months has either experienced something unusual in that room personally, or has heard first-hand accounts from workers they trust. The room itself is not a standard single layout. It's more like a small suite or apartment, with a common living area immediately inside the front door, a television mounted on the wall, and small table and chairs, and then two separate bedrooms branching off from that main space. The design is convenient for families or groups traveling together, but that layout also means that sound travels in strange ways, and people can move between rooms without being seen from the main entrance. Over time, that detail has become important in many of the incidents that have been reported. The first time something happened to me personally in that room was during a normal daytime shift when I was assigned to clean it after a guest had checked out. Nothing about the situation seemed unusual at first. I had my cart in the hallway, my cleaning supplies ready, and I followed the same routine I always did. I started in one of the bedrooms, stripping the sheets from the bed, collecting the used towels, wiping down surfaces, and yes, dear guests, even trying to sweep under the bed. While I was in the middle of that process, I clearly heard the main door to the suite open. It sounded exactly like the familiar electronic click of a keycard, followed by the heavy door swinging inward. The sound was so distinct that I did not question it at all. My immediate assumption was that the guest had returned unexpectedly, perhaps forgetting something important in the room after checkout. That does happen, so I called out from the bedroom in a polite voice, apologizing for still being inside, and explained that I would be finishing up quickly. However, there was no response. I waited for a moment, expecting to hear footsteps or a voice answering back, but the suite remained completely silent. Thinking maybe they had not heard me from the other side of the living area, I called out again a little louder this time, but still received no reply. And it was at that point a small feeling of confusion began to creep in, because the sound of the door opening had been unmistakable. I stepped out of the bedroom into the main living area to see who had entered, expecting to find someone standing there or gathering their belongings. The room was empty. I stood there for several seconds looking around the space, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. I checked the second bedroom just in case someone had walked directly into it without responding to me. But that room was also empty. There were no open suitcases, no movement, and no sign that anyone had come in at all. The front door was still closed exactly the way I had left it. I finished cleaning the room, but the entire time I felt uneasy. After I completed the job, I went down the hallway to find a coworker who had been working nearby and asked him if he had seen anyone enter the suite while I was inside. He told me that he had not seen anyone go in or out beside me. I pressed him a little further, explaining that I was certain I had heard the door open, and he confirmed again that no one had passed him in the hallway. That was the first moment I realized there might be something abnormal about that room. A separate incident involving that same suite happened to another employee not long after my experience. He was working a service shift one evening, delivering drinks to guests in different rooms. At one point, he accidentally dropped the tray he was carrying, and several glasses shattered to the floor, creating a loud crashing noise that echoed down the hallway. Almost immediately after the sound, he heard footsteps coming from the direction of the suite, followed by the distinct sound of a door opening and then closing again. He assumed that a guest had stepped out to see what caused the commotion, so he focused on cleaning up the broken glass and preparing a new tray. Later that night, after he finished the delivery, he mentioned the incident casually to another co-worker and joked that he must have disturbed the people staying in the nearby suite. When he identified the exact room number, the other employee's expression changed, and he told him that that suite had not been occupied at all that evening. The room, in fact, had been empty for the entire shift. The two of them decided to check the suite together, partly out of curiosity and partly out of concern that someone might have entered without authorization. So when they unlocked the door and stepped inside, they found no one in the living area or either bedroom. However, something else immediately caught their attention. Every piece of glassware stored in the cabinets had been shattered. Cups, glasses, and small dishes were broken into fragments, scattered across the shelves and countertops as if they'd been struck with force. Yet there was no obvious explanation for how that could have happened, especially in a room that had been empty all night. After hearing that story and reflecting on my own experience, I became noticeably more cautious whenever I had to enter that suite alone. There was a lingering sense of tension in that space, even during the quiet daytime hours when nothing unusual was happening. Over time, I started to hear additional stories from other staff members, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. One evening, the hotel was unusually slow, with only 2 guests checked in for the entire night. Because business was so quiet, management assigned me extra responsibilities to keep me occupied during my shift. One of those tasks involved walking through vacant rooms to make sure all the lights were turned off. It is surprisingly common for guests to leave lights on after they check out, and management tries to conserve electricity whenever possible. I went through each room methodically, flipping switches and double-checking corners to ensure everything was dark before moving on. After finishing the entire floor, I returned to the front desk and completed my remaining duties. The night passed quickly, and I ended up finishing my work nearly 2 hours earlier than usual. Normally, in a situation like that, I would have been allowed to clock out early, but the supervisor on duty asked me to do one final walkthrough before leaving. I agreed and started the process again. As I moved down the hallway, I noticed that all the rooms I had previously checked were still dark, just as I had left them. Everything seemed normal, until I reached one particular room where every light was suddenly on. The glow was visible through the small gap beneath the door, and bright enough to stand out in the otherwise dim corridor. I stopped in front of the door, feeling a wave of confusion wash over me, because I knew with certainty that I had already been inside that room earlier and turned off every single light. There was no reason, no way for them to be on again. Assuming that I must have missed something or that, more likely, another employee had entered the room for some reason, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was empty. I walked through the space, switched off the lights one by one, checking each fixture carefully. When I finished, I turned toward the door to leave, and as I reached for the handle, the lamp next to the bed suddenly turned itself back on. The light clicked on with a sharp sound that echoed in that silent room. That moment sent a rush of adrenaline through my body, and I did not stay to investigate further. I left the room immediately, closed the door behind me, and decided not to mention the incident to management because I knew they would likely dismiss it as an electrical issue. And the experience stayed with me, adding to the growing list of things that did not make sense. Another encounter happened earlier this year and remains one of the most unsettling experiences I have had at the hotel. I had just finished cleaning one room and was heading down the hallway towards the supply closet to gather fresh linens for the next assignment. As I walked, I noticed a woman wearing a white robe moving slowly towards a room at the far end of the corridor. She had brown hair that fell to about shoulder length, and her posture was calm. There was nothing outwardly alarming about her appearance, so I assumed she was simply returning to her room after using the pool or sauna. A few minutes later, I checked my assignment list and realized the next room scheduled for cleaning was located in that same hallway. I immediately remembered seeing the woman enter the area and assumed she had gone into that room. That meant I would need to knock and ask her when it would be convenient to clean. When I reached the door, I knocked gently and waited. There was no reply. I knocked again louder this time and waited longer, and the hallway remained silent. After about 30 seconds, I used my keycard to open the door slightly and call out to her to make sure everything was all right, but there was still no answer. I stepped inside and looked around the room, carefully scanning every corner. The bed was neatly made, the bathroom was empty, and there was no sign that anyone had been there at all. The realization that I had definitely seen someone walk towards that exact location only moments earlier made my chest tighten with fear. I backed out of the room quickly, closed the door, and returned to the hallway with a racing heartbeat. When I told a co-worker what had happened, he did not seem surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly and said that other employees had reported seeing the same woman before. That was the moment I began to understand that the stories about the hotel were not isolated incidents, but something that had been happening for years. As I continued, I heard more stories from co-workers about unusual experiences in different parts of the hotel, and one area that constantly came up in conversation was the basement. The basement is used primarily by staff for storage and maintenance, and guests rarely have any reason to go down there. It connects to several back corridors and service rooms that allow employees to move supplies without passing through the main lobby, which makes it practical for operations, but also means it can feel isolated, especially during night shifts. The lighting is not particularly bright, and some of the hallways are narrow with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. There is also a persistent musty smell that never fully goes away, no matter how often the space is ventilated or cleaned. And it's safe to say, given the description, most employees do not like going down there alone unless absolutely necessary. One of the incidents that stands out the most to me personally happened on Thanksgiving night back in 2018. The hotel was not very busy because many people were spending the holiday at their home with their families, so management decided it would be a good opportunity to begin preparing for the upcoming Christmas season. And part of that preparation involved bringing decorations up from storage so they could be placed around the building in the following days. I was asked to help retrieve some of those decorations, which meant going down into the basement to find the boxes we needed. There is one particular storage room in the basement that employees have nicknamed the Dungeon. The name began as a joke because the room is small, poorly lit, and has concrete walls that makes it feel more like a utility chamber than its storage area, and over time, the nickname stuck. Not only for the reasons I mentioned, but because of how uncomfortable people felt while they were inside it. The air in that room is heavier than other parts of the basement, and the silence can be unsettling, especially when you're alone. So that night, I walked down the stairs carrying a flashlight, even though the overhead lights were on, simply because the corners of that room can be difficult to see clearly. As I entered the dungeon and began looking through the stacks of boxes labeled with different holiday decorations, after a few minutes, I found the container that held wreaths, which were exactly what management had asked me to take upstairs. I picked up 2 boxes and turned towards the door to leave. It was that exact moment I heard a voice clear as day next to my ear say, "Wrong one." The voice was not distant or muffled. It sounded as if someone had leaned in close and spoken directly beside me. The tone was calm and matter-of-fact, neither threatening nor aggressive, but the suddenness of it made my entire body tense. I immediately spun around, expecting to see another employee standing behind me. But the room was completely empty. There was no one in the doorway, no movement in the hallway, and no sound of footsteps retreating. I stood there for a few moments, frozen in place, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Eventually, I convinced myself that it might have been my imagination, or an echo from another part of the basement. I mean, I've heard it be said that sometimes sound does mysterious stuff. It was probably one of those things. So I carried the boxes upstairs and delivered them to the area where decorations were being organized. Later, when the boxes were opened, we discovered that one of the wreaths was missing several pieces and could not be used. That detail stuck with me, because it made the words I had heard feel less like a random hallucination and more like a warning. But from who or what, I didn't know. After that experience, I became even more cautious whenever I had to work alone in the basement. I was not the only one who felt uneasy about that space. Several co-workers had shared stories about hearing footsteps behind them or sensing movement in peripheral vision when no one else was present. Some described feeling as if they were being watched, even though security camera footage showed the hallways were empty at all times. Another co-worker once told me about an incident involving candles in one of the guest rooms. Part of his job involved preparing rooms for special occasions, and on that particular evening, he had been asked to set up candles for a romantic package that included dinner and overnight accommodation. He carefully placed several candles around the room, lit them, and then left, briefly, to retrieve additional towels from the supply closet. When he returned only a few minutes later, every candle had been extinguished. He assumed at first he might have made a mistake when lighting them, so he relit each one and stepped out again to finish gathering supplies. When he came back a second time, the candles were out once more. This pattern repeated itself several times, and each time he re-entered the room, the flames were gone, even though there was no draft strong enough to put them out. Eventually, he gave up and left the candles unlit. Later that evening, after the guests checked in, they called the front desk to complain that the candles in their room had not been lit when they arrived as they had specified, even though he knew he had lit them repeatedly before leaving. That discrepancy left him feeling frustrated and confused, and when he shared the story with other staff members, many of them nodded as if they had heard similar accounts before. Another story that circulates among employees involves a former groundskeeper by the name of Sam. He worked at the property for many years and took great pride in maintaining the landscaping. He was known for being meticulous about trimming hedges, mowing grass, planting the seasonal flowers in neat, symmetrical patterns, and according to longtime staff members, he cared deeply about the appearance of the grounds and treated the property almost as if it were his own home. Several years ago, Sam suffered a fatal heart attack while working outside and passed away shortly after. His death affected many people who knew him, especially those who had worked alongside him for years. Since then, some of the current groundskeepers have reported hearing a voice commenting on their work when they finish a task. The voice is usually described as male and calm, offering simple remarks like approval or encouragement about how the property looks. These reports are not constant. They do not happen every day, but they occur often enough that the story has become part of the hotel's unofficial history. Some employees believe that Sam's presence still lingers because of how dedicated he was to his job. Others think the experience can be explained by imagination or stress, especially during long shifts in quiet outdoor areas. All the same, the story continues to circulate among staff. Beyond individual incidents, there is also a broader history connected to the land itself, because according to management records and local accounts, the property where the hotel now stands used to be farmland for more than a century, before construction began in the early 1990s. The area was originally owned by a family who cultivated crops and raised livestock on the land for generations. Eventually, the property was sold to developers, and the hotel was built as part of a larger commercial project. Employees who have researched the history of the site say that the unusual occurrences started being reported only a few months after the hotel opened. At first, the stories were minor and infrequent, often dismissed as coincidence or misunderstandings. Over time, though, the number of reports increased and patterns began to emerge. Certain rooms, hallways, and service areas seemed to be associated with repeated incidents, while other parts of the building remained completely normal. One event that stands out in the hotel's records happened in 2007, when a woman drowned in a pond located in the wooded area near the property. The circumstances surrounding the incident were tragic, and emergency services responded quickly, but they were unable to save her. After that event, some employees began reporting sightings of a woman in a white robe walking through hallways or near guest rooms, especially during late-night shifts. The description of that figure matches the woman I saw earlier in the corridor, which is why the experience affected me so strongly. Even though I cannot prove any connection between the sighting and the drowning incident, the similarity in appearance has led many staff members to believe the two events might be related. Whether that belief is accurate or not, the story has become part of the larger narrative surrounding the hotel. By the time I had been working there for a while, it was clear that these incidents were not isolated. They formed a pattern that stretched across years of operation, involving multiple employees from different departments. Some people tried to ignore the stories and focus on their work, while others became increasingly cautious about certain areas of the building. Regardless of personal beliefs, they shared experiences and created a sense that something unusual had been happening long before any of us were hired. As more years passed and more employees came and went, stories about unusual activity at the hotel continued to accumulate, and management gradually began keeping informal notes about incidents that were hard to explain. One of the earliest events that people still talk about happened several years before I started working there. It must have been in the early 2000s. At the time, the hotel had only been open for a short period, and most staff members were still becoming familiar with daily routines. One morning, housekeeping employees entered a guest room that had been cleaned the night before and left in perfect condition. When they opened the door, they immediately noticed that something was wrong. The bed linens had been pulled off the mattress, pillows were scattered across the floor, and sheets were twisted and thrown around the room as if someone had deliberately made a mess. However, there were no signs of forced entry, and according to the front desk records, the room had not been assigned to any guest overnight. Maintenance workers checked the door lock, the windows to make sure there had not been tampered with, but everything appeared to be functioning normally. The situation left staff members unsettled because there was no obvious explanation for how the room could have been disturbed when no one was supposed to be inside. That incident marked one of the first times employees began seriously discussing the possibility that something unusual might be happening in the building. Before that point, most strange occurrences had been small and easy to dismiss, like objects falling from shelves or lights flickering unexpectedly. Afterwards, people started paying closer attention to patterns. Over the following years, reports of unexplained noises became more frequent. Employees working late shifts sometimes heard footsteps on staircases or in hallways, even when security cameras showed no movement. Others described hearing doors open and close in empty corridors. These sounds were often subtle, but they happened often enough that staff members began sharing stories during shift changes and staff meetings. while management generally tried to reassure everyone that the building was safe and that most issues could be explained by mechanical problems or normal building noises. The number of reports continued to grow. At some point, curiosity led a few employees to conduct small, informal experiments to see whether certain sounds would trigger responses in specific rooms. One of the most talked about attempts involved the same suite where the glassware had once been found shattered. Staff members wondered whether loud noises in nearby areas might cause activity inside the room, similar to what had been reported in earlier incidents. To test that idea, an employee intentionally dropped a box containing broken glass pieces into a service area below the suite. The noise was loud enough to echo through the surrounding corridors, and after making the sound, the employee waited to see whether anything unusual would happen. In that moment, nothing seemed to change. The hallway remained quiet, and there was no visible disturbances. However, during the following week, several employees who entered that suite reported feeling uneasy, as if they were not alone, even when that room was empty. None of them saw anything specific, but they shared a sense of discomfort that was strong enough that they mentioned it to their supervisors. Management recorded those reports but did not take any formal action, partly because there was no physical evidence of a problem. Another pattern that became noticeable over time involved temperature differences in certain rooms. Guests occasionally complained that their rooms felt unusually cold, even when thermostats were set to higher temperatures. Maintenance technicians inspected heating systems and ventilation units repeatedly, but they could find no mechanical faults that would explain the issue. In some cases, employees noticed the same temperature change when they entered those rooms for cleaning, which made the reports more difficult to dismiss as simple customer perception. Around the same period, management began reviewing historical records related to the property in an effort to understand whether past events might be connected to the experiences employees were reporting. So according to local archive, and as we've already discussed, the land had been used as farmland for about 170 years before it was sold to developers. But during that time, several accidents had occurred involving farm workers, including injuries from heavy equipment and exposure to harsh weather conditions. While most of these incidents were not well documented, they were mentioned in regional newspapers and community records. Some staff members speculated that those events might explain why certain areas of the hotel seemed to have more activity than others, especially in locations built directly over the former farm work sites. Despite these discussions, daily operations at the hotel continued as usual. Guests checked in and out, housekeeping cleaned rooms, and maintenance handled repairs. For the most part, visitors remained unaware of the stories circulating among staff. Employees rarely discussed unusual incidents with guests because management preferred to avoid creating unnecessary concern or attracting unwanted attention. Still, within the staff community, the reputation of certain rooms and hallways became well established. One of the most significant developments occurred when a guest who identified herself as a medium stayed at the hotel while traveling for a public event. She had heard rumors about unexplained activity at the property and requested to be placed in a room where previous incidents had been reported. Management agreed to her request, partly out of curiosity and partly because they believed the experience might provide reassurance if nothing unusual happened. The woman stayed for 2 nights, and according to management, she reported sensing the presence of a young child in the room. She described the presence as playful rather than threatening, and suggested that it might be responsible for minor disturbances, such as lights turning on or off, objects being moved out of place. She also stated that she did not sense any harmful intention from whatever presence she believed was there. While some employees found her comments comforting, others remained skeptical because there was no way to verify her claims scientifically. After her visit, discussions about the hotel's reputation intensified among staff members. Some people became more interested in researching the property's history, while others preferred to avoid the topic entirely. Regardless of personal beliefs, the pattern of experiences continued, and new employees quickly learned which areas of the building were considered unusual. By the time I had been working there for a few years, it was clear that the stories were not fading away. Instead, they were becoming part of the culture of the workplace itself. New incidences were added to the list periodically, which only reinforced the idea that whatever was happening had been occurring long before any current staff members arrived. Following the visit from the medium, conversations among staff became more frequent. This wasn't because activity suddenly increased, but because people felt more comfortable acknowledging experiences they might previously have kept to themselves. Management did not make any official statements about paranormal explanations, but they did continue documenting unusual maintenance reports and guest complaints that could not be resolved through conventional means. Over time, these records formed an informal timeline that employees occasionally referenced when trying to understand patterns in the building. One of the entities often discussed involved another incident in this same large suite that had been the focus of the earlier stories. A housekeeping supervisor had inspected the room late one evening after it had been cleaned and confirmed that everything was in order before locking the door. The next morning, when staff returned to prepare the room for the new guests, they discovered that furniture had been moved slightly out of place. A chair that normally sat against the wall was positioned at an angle near the center of the room, and a bedside lamp had been turned on, though it had been switched off the previous night. There were no signs of forced entry, and the electronic lock showed no record of anyone entering the room after the supervisor left. Maintenance checked the door mechanism and confirmed that it had functioned properly throughout the night. Events like that were not dramatic on their own, but the repetition over many years made them difficult to ignore. Employees began recognizing certain themes in the reports, like lights turning on without explanation, objects changing position, and sounds occurring in empty spaces. Another situation that contributed to the hotel's reputation involved a maintenance technician who was working alone in the early morning hours. He had been tasked with repairing a plumbing issue in a guest room that had been temporarily taken out of service. After shutting off the water supply and gathering his tools, he stepped into the hallway to retrieve an additional wrench from his cart. When he returned to the room a few moments later, he noticed that the bathroom light, which he distinctly remembered turning off before leaving, was glowing again. Assuming he had made a simple mistake, he switched the light off and resumed his work. A short time later, while kneeling beside the sink, he heard the faint sound of movement behind him, similar to the soft rustling of fabric. He turned around immediately, expecting to see another employee entering the room. But the doorway was empty. The hall outside was quiet, and there was no sign that anyone had passed by. The technician finished the repair and reported the experience to his supervisor, not because he believed something supernatural had occurred, but because he wanted to document anything unusual just in case it was a safety concern. The supervisor added the note to the maintenance log, where it joined dozens of similar entries describing unexplained sounds or changes in lighting. Over time, those records created a pattern that was difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. In addition to staff experiences, a small number of guests had also reported strange observations. Most of those reports involved minor issues, such as televisions turning on unexpectedly or hearing footsteps in adjacent rooms that were unoccupied. Guests rarely used the word paranormal, but they sometimes described feeling uneasy or having difficulty sleeping without being able to identify a specific cause. Front desk employees typically responded by offering room changes or complimentary services, and in most cases the situation was resolved without further complaint. One guest account that circulated among staff was about a family who stayed in the hotel during a winter holiday. According to the front desk notes, The parents contacted reception late at night to report that their young child kept insisting someone was playing in their room after everyone else had gone to bed. The parents contacted reception late at night to report that their young child kept insisting someone was playing in the room after everyone else had gone to bed. The parents initially assumed the child was imagining things, but they became concerned when toys placed neatly on a table were found scattered across the floor the next morning. Housekeeping staff later confirmed that the items had been moved between cleaning visits, even though no one had entered the room during that time. The family checked out earlier than planned, but did not request a refund and did not provide further details about what they experienced. As years passed, renovations and upgrades were completed throughout the building, new lighting systems were installed, carpets were replaced, and electronic locks were updated with improved security features. Management hoped that modernizing the infrastructure would eliminate many of the mechanical explanations people had considered for earlier incidents. The upgrades did reduce technical problems, such as faulty wiring or malfunctioning thermostats. However, employees continued reporting the same type of occurrence even after those improvements were made, suggesting that equipment issues were not the sole cause. By the time I reached my current position at the hotel, the stories had become part of everyday conversation among longtime staff members. They were not treated as proof or anything supernatural, but they were acknowledged. New employees were often surprised to learn of how many incidents had been recorded over the years. One of the last notable developments occurred when management decided to review older incident logs as part of a safety audit. During the process, they noted that many of the reports describing unusual activity were concentrated in specific areas of the property, particularly the large suite and the sections of the building closest to the wooded land behind the hotel. That observation did not lead to any official conclusion, but it reinforced the idea that patterns existed within the report. Maintenance teams double-checked electrical systems, plumbing lines, and structural components in those areas to rule out mechanical causes, and after a thorough inspection, confirmed that the equipment was functioning properly. Despite those findings, employees continued sharing occasional stories that kept the hotel's reputation alive. One housekeeper described hearing soft knocking sounds from inside a room she had just locked after finishing her cleaning. When she reopened the door to investigate, the room was empty and nothing disturbed. Another staff member working an overnight shift reported hearing a faint sound of running water in a bathroom that had already been inspected and confirmed to be dry. Situations like this were brief and subtle, but they added to the long list of similar experiences that have been documented over the years. To this day, the building operates like any other. Guests check in, families celebrate special occasions, and us employees perform our duties. But behind those normal routines exists the record of things that have never been fully explained away. And with that concludes the story of the hotel I currently work at. Hopefully, I won't have more to add anytime soon. Be careful out there, dear guests. In 2017, I was 21, and I traveled to Germany with a friend who was 23, and my cousin who was 20. The trip was started because my friend wanted to visit Germany to meet her German side of the family, but she was nervous about going alone. I suggested that we travel together first so she could get comfortable being in a foreign country before meeting them. We flew into Germany, and earlier into the trip took a train to Paris where we spent about 3 days. Everything felt normal at that point. We did typical tourist activities, explored the city, and got used to navigating the train system. By the 4th day, we decided to head back towards Germany and stay in a small town about an hour outside of Munich. It was the last stop on the train line. We arrived around midnight. The town was quiet and almost completely empty, and we had to drag our luggage through the streets while trying to find somewhere to stay. Eventually, we found a small place called Happy Hotel, and were given room 14. The room was simple. My friend and cousin took the larger bed, and I took a small twin bed on the other side of a partial dividing wall. That first night I barely slept. I had constant nightmares and woke up feeling like I hadn't rested at all, and by morning I was on edge and unusually jumpy, but I tried to brush it off. The next day, my friend suggested we go out and explore the town. It was bright and sunny, and the place itself was quiet and welcoming. It was obvious we stood out as tourists, but the locals were friendly. People greeted us, tried to speak English with us, and seemed genuinely happy to have us there. At one point, we even saw cows being walked down the road, which added to the feeling that we were somewhere very far from home. We spent the day walking around, shopping, sightseeing, and later went back to the hotel where my friend cooked a traditional German meal. And that evening we sat and watched a thunderstorm roll in. It felt calm and almost perfect, which made what happened later feel even more unsettling. That night, we went to bed as usual. At some point I woke up in the middle of the night. From where I was lying, I could see a mirror that reflected part of the room, including my friend sleeping in the other bed. At first, everything looked normal. Then my head started to hurt, suddenly, and I heard a sound that can only be described as similar to a table saw. It was loud and sharp, and when I looked back towards the mirror, my friend was gone. The bed was disturbed and the covers were thrown aside, and there were personal items like a watch and nightstand. I looked at my cousin and the same thing happened again. The noise, pain in my head, and she was gone too. In her place was a woman I didn't recognize. She had blonde hair pulled into a bun, and she was staring directly at me. And there was something in her expression that felt so aggressive and hateful. I looked at myself again, and once more I heard the sound and felt the same intense pain, but the reflection was not me anymore. The person I saw looked younger, with blonde hair, and had a terrified expression, and before I could process it further, the woman was suddenly on top of me. She was pressing her hands over my mouth and nose, and I could not breathe. I tried to fight her off, to push her away, but I could not get free. The pressure on my chest and face felt real, and I was struggling to get air. Then I heard my friend's voice, distant at first, telling me to wake up. She sounded urgent, repeating that I needed to wake up immediately. At the same time, I became aware of a bright light, but I felt like I was being pulled back and forth between that and the struggle. The light appeared again, and then suddenly I was sitting upright in bed. My chest hurt, my lungs felt like they were burning, and my head was pounding. I climbed out of bed and started searching for ibuprofen in my backpack. I couldn't find it right away, and I started to panic. I ended up dumping everything on the floor while kneeling trying to locate it. And that's when I realized my friends were still asleep. At that point I broke down. I began crying uncontrollably and woke both of my friends and my cousin. I was shaking so badly I couldn't even open the bottle when I finally found it. My friend helped me, gave me the medication, and stayed with me while I calmed down. Eventually, I lay down with both of them in the same bed but couldn't fall asleep. The next morning I told them everything that happened. I wanted to leave immediately, but they convinced me to stay one more night. That following night I refused to sleep in the small bed. My friend took it instead. Around midnight she woke up and climbed into bed with us. She said she had felt something pushing down on her chest while she was lying there. After that, I didn't sleep at all. We left on the first train out of town that next morning. I've never experienced anything like that before or since, and I don't want to, ever again. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was staying at a hotel with my mum in Carlsbad. From the moment we settled in that evening, it felt uneasy. It wasn't anything specific I could pinpoint. The room looked normal enough, nothing seemed out of place, but there was this underlying feeling I couldn't shake. Telling myself I tend to get paranoid in unfamiliar places, especially hotels. Later that night, as I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I suddenly felt a warm light against my closed eyes. At first, I assumed it was just headlights from a passing car outside. That seemed like the most logical explanation, so I didn't think much of it. But the light didn't fade. It stayed consistent, almost steady, which didn't match what I would expect from a car passing by. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes. There was an orange orb floating above my bed. I remember just staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't flicker or distort. It was stable, bright and clearly defined, and the light it gave off filled the room with a warm orange glow, with hints of yellow spreading across the walls and ceiling. It wasn't dim or faint. It was strong enough to illuminate the entire space around me, and for a moment I genuinely questioned whether I was dreaming. I shifted slightly in bed, propping myself up just enough to get a better look, but the orb didn't disappear or change. It remained there, suspended in the air, exactly where it had been. Then, without warning, it moved. It began to spiral around the room in a smooth, controlled motion. It didn't dart or flicker like a reflection or a random light source. It moved, tracing a path through the air before suddenly passing straight through the wall above me. As soon as it was gone, the room went completely dark again, and I sat there for a second trying to process what had just happened. And then I reached over and tapped my mum to wake her up. I asked her if she had seen anything, but she was fully asleep. She just mumbled something about going to sleep and didn't wake up. I got out of bed and checked the curtains. They were fully closed, thick, blackout curtains with no gaps. There was no way light from outside could have come through that. I even looked around the room to see if there was a device or any source that could have caused it, but there was nothing. What stood out to me the most was what happened next. I went back to bed and fell asleep without any trouble. Looking back, that part feels almost stranger than the experience itself, as something like that would have surely kept me awake or anxious. But I slept deeply. When I woke up the next morning, the memory came back to me immediately, and I was surprised about how calm I'd been afterwards. Most people suggested it was a kind of hallucination, but the way I experienced it didn't feel like that. It was completely three-dimensional. It felt like it was physically present in the room with me, and I was fully awake for when it happened. I don't have a clear explanation for it, and haven't experienced anything like it before or since. But I'm interested to hear if anyone else perhaps can fill me in on what it might have been. Around 2 a.m., 5 of us drove into Aeri Colony, which is a place in India, and it feels completely different at night than it does during the day. During the day, it is just another stretch of greenery, but after dark, it carries this reputation. People say it's haunted and that strange things happen there. Whether you believe that or not is down to you, but the atmosphere does noticeably change when you're inside. We drove deeper into the area until we reached the gate of the Imperial Palace, an abandoned 5-star hotel that had been left to decay. The building itself already feels out of place, like it shouldn't be there, and we pulled up directly in front of the gate and stopped the car. The headlights were still on, lighting up the entire entrance. It was not dark where we were. Everything in front of us was clearly visible and easy to make out. None of us got out the car yet. We just sat there for a moment taking in the surroundings. And that's when we saw a guard standing behind the gate wearing a blue uniform positioned just a short distance inside. He was not hiding or moving around. He was simply standing there, facing directly towards us, with 2 dogs beside him. I immediately pointed him out. Instead of agreeing, the others reacted with confusion. All 4 of them said there was no one there. They told me they could clearly see the 2 dogs, but insisted there was no guard standing behind the gate. At first, I assumed they were joking or trying to mess with me, but it quickly became clear that they were being serious. They kept repeating that they could not see anyone except the dogs. We sat there arguing for about 2 minutes, all of us looking at the exact same spot. I could see the guard the entire time, his uniform, his posture, and the way he was standing there, all clearly visible to me. There was nothing strange or distorted about him. He looked completely ordinary. To them, however, the space was empty. The longer the argument went on, the more uncomfortable it became. It was no longer just confusion. I started to feel uncomfortable. We were all in the same car, under the same light, looking at the same place, yet somehow were seeing 2 very different things. I decided I didn't want to be there any longer, and so I drove away. We went about a kilometer down the road before stopping again. The argument continued. They insisted that no one had been there, and I insisted that there had been. None of us could explain it. and none of us were willing to change our position on the matter. Eventually, they convinced me to go back and check again, so we turned around and drove back to the same gate. We stopped in the exact same spot, with the headlights lighting up the entrance just as before. This time we did not say anything at first, but simply sat there and watched. And for a while, there was nothing. Then after a short pause, the same guard in the same blue uniform appeared again, and stood between the gate in almost the exact same position as before. The 2 dogs were still there, but this time all 5 of us saw him. There was no confusion or disagreement. Everyone in the car acknowledged him immediately, and he looked completely normal. He was standing casually and looking down at his phone, as if he were on a routine shift. We watched him, and then eventually left. To this day, none of us can explain what happened during those first 2 minutes. I saw someone who, for reasons we still do not understand, no one else could see at the time. And when we returned, he was visible to everyone, as if he'd been there all along. Weird. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories, and I also would like to apologize for there being no video on Tuesday, and the whole schedule kind of being out of whack this week. So, a teacher quit at my daughter's school, and honestly, it's kind of thrown my whole schedule and week out of whack, and it's been really hard to kind of manage everything and create the videos on time, so I'm very sorry to everyone, but hopefully now we should be able to follow a more consistent schedule. And speaking of schedules, next week I am going to have Nature Week. We're going to have middle of nowhere, deep woods, cabins, haunted woods, and finishing up the week with cryptids. So it's going to be a good week to tune in. One final thank you to my amazing members and patrons whose names you can see on screen. But until next time, good night.